If you want to know who should be an all-star in the NBA, you should probably start by watching NBA basketball and then formulating your own opinion. But if you can't watch every game, or if you simply want some extra context for which players have been putting up the best stats this year, here's a simple formula for who should be an all-star in the NBA this season. Okay, so it's pretty straightforward. It has 4 components, and we're going to start with the most fundamental stat in all of sports: wins. How many times have you been on the court for a win this season? Now, it's important to note, this is individual player wins, not their team's wins overall, because I don't think you should get credit for your team's wins while you weren't on the court. For instance, the LA Clippers this season have won 25 games so far, but Kawhi Leonard has only been on the court for 15 of those wins, so he would get a 15 for this part of the equation. I also didn't want to just use games played because I don't think a loss should be contributing to your all-star candidacy either. Okay, so next we're going to add the second component to the equation, and that is box score stats. We're going to keep it super simple here. It's just going to be points, rebounds, and assists. You could add steals, blocks, turnovers, fouls, etc., but we're just going to keep it traditional with the main 3 box score stats. Now, you might argue that some players get an unfair bump here by putting up empty stats. For instance, Kevin Porter Jr. this season for the Rockets is averaging 19 points, 5.5 rebounds, and 5.5 assists per game. He's kind of the prototypical good stats, bad team player. But that's why box score stats are just one of the 4 components in the equation. A player like KPJ is already getting dinged for his lack of wins, and he's not going to be doing great with the next 2 components either. So, for our third part of the equation, we're looking at efficiency, field goal percentage, 3-point percentage, free throw percentage. All of these contribute to how efficiently a player is scoring the basketball. Additionally, it matters what proportion of shots you take from each spot on the court. If you're a knockdown 3-point shooter and you take a lot of threes, that's more valuable than if you hit the same proportion of shots from 2. So luckily, there's one metric that takes all of this into account: true shooting percentage. It combines all the different percentages and weights them appropriately, taking into account, for instance, that 3 is worth more than 2, and taking into account where most of your shots are coming from. So that should work perfectly, except in order for this to fit into our equation, we're going to need to adjust it slightly because a big number like 60% isn't really compatible with the numbers that we've been using up to this point in our equation. Plus, as we've seen over the past few seasons with efficiency across the board in the NBA skyrocketing, your raw percentage doesn't tell the whole story if you don't know what's typical for the entire league. A true shooting percentage of 60% in 2003 would have been off the charts, but that same shooting percentage 20 years later is just par for the course amongst the elite players. So what we're going to use for the equation is the difference between league average true shooting percentage and a player's individual true shooting percentage. For instance, league average this season is about 58%, while Steph Curry's true shooting percentage this season is about 65%. That's 7 percentage points better than league average. So for this part of the equation, Steph would get 7. Okay, so that's 3 of the 4 components done. We have wins, box score stats, and efficiency. All of those so far have been easy to quantify. There's tangible numbers associated with each one. But the last ingredient that I want to add is something a little more ephemeral, something that might be difficult to quantify. It's the concept of, are you a winning player? Now, you might argue that all 3 of those first components of the equation are already addressing this, especially the first part, wins. But I would argue that there's still players being overlooked with those first 3 parts. For instance, let's consider Jimmy Butler. So far, the Heat have not exactly had the best season, and so Jimmy's only racked up 19 wins, which is a lot less than several other guys ahead of him in the All-Star considerations. Plus, his box score stats are solid: 22 points, 6 rebounds, and 5 assists, but they're not even close to the other elite players like Luka Doncic or Giannis Antetokounmpo. And his efficiency doesn't really jump off the page either. His true shooting percentage is just above league average. But with all of that being said, when you watch Jimmy Butler play, he's just a winning player. It's clear from his defense to his decision-making, his leadership, and even his clutch scoring. It's all the little things that are difficult to quantify that make Butler a winning player. But we need to quantify it for this equation, so what could we use? Well, one option that you could try would be plus minus. How much does your team score or concede while you're on the court? That kind of works, but raw plus minus isn't perfect because lesser players can be dragged to an incredible plus minus if they simply play for an elite team. Like Derek White with the Celtics, for example, has a really dominant plus 5.7 plus minus, but I don't think anybody's arguing that Derek White should be an all-star. He just happens to play for the most dominant team in the league. So raw plus minus won't work, but I think it's on the right track. So instead, we're going to use a different version of it. We're going to try box plus minus, which is a variation of plus minus that adjusts for teammate quality in order to get the most accurate picture possible of a player's impact while they're on the court. So if we go back to Jimmy Butler, his regular plus minus is barely above 0 because his teammates have been pretty disappointing this season. But his box plus minus is impressively plus 7.6, which is top 10 in the league. So box plus minus should work. That'll be our final component in the equation, which hopefully encapsulates that elusive question of, are you a winning player? So that's it. We have our NBA All-Star equation done. The 4 components are wins, box score stats, efficiency, and box plus minus. If we actually run the numbers, we can see who the equation thinks should be an All-Star this season in the NBA. Now, let's keep in mind that the All-Star team is structured as follows. The starters have 2 guards and 3 front court players. The reserves also have 2 guards and 3 front court players and 2 wildcard spots. And that's it. There's just 12 spots in each conference, plus any injury replacements. So let's go ahead and run the numbers and see who ends up on our All-Star teams for the Eastern and Western conferences. Alright, so in the Western Conference, our starting guards are Steph Curry and Luka Doncic. Then our starting front court is Nikola Jokic, Domantas Sabonis, and Lauri Markkanen. Then for the reserves, at guard we have Shai Gilgeous-Alexander and Ja Morant. No surprises there. Then in the front court we have Anthony Davis, LeBron James, and Zion Williamson. Then for those last 2 wildcard spots, we have Damian Lillard and Aaron Gordon. And then for the honorable mentions, the players who just missed the cut, we have De'Aaron Fox, Devin Booker, Christian Wood, and Anthony Edwards. Okay, so one thing to address right off the bat here is the question of games played. For this list, no one was excluded from consideration due to games played. I just wanted to see how it all shook out and then potentially make changes afterwards. So looking at it now, the 3 players who are potentially on the chopping block are Anthony Davis with 25 games played, and then Zion Williamson and Devin Booker with 29 games played. It's really close, obviously, but as of right now, I'm leaning towards keeping Zion and Booker, but excluding AD, because in terms of percentages, he's at just over 50% of his team's games, whereas Booker and Zion are at just over 60%, and that seems like a fair cutoff. So I would remove Davis, slide Gordon into his spot, and then slide De'Aaron Fox into that final wildcard spot. Otherwise, I think it's a pretty fair list. Obviously, in real life, LeBron James is going to start, which I think is totally fair. He's been incredible this season. But I wouldn't change anything else, except for maybe replacing Lillard with Booker or Edwards, but honestly, their teams have all been a little bit disappointing, so I don't feel that strongly about it either way. Alright, moving on to the Eastern Conference, our starting guards are Donovan Mitchell and Jaylen Brown. Then the starting front court is Jason Tatum, Joel Embiid, and Kevin Durant. The front court in the Eastern Conference is the most stacked position, with Giannis Antetokounmpo just missing out. So then for the reserves, we have James Harden and Tyrese Halliburton at guard. Then in the front court, it's the aforementioned Giannis Antetokounmpo, and then there's a bit of a drop-off, and it's Julius Randle and Jimmy Butler. Then in those final 2 wildcard spots, we have Kyrie Irving and Nick Claxton. Then for the honorable mentions, the players who just missed the cut, we have Trae Young, Jarrett Allen, DeMar DeRozan, and Bam Adebayo. Alright, so here in the Eastern Conference, we did not have anybody with the games played issue, but there are a couple of interesting inclusions and omissions. Nick Claxton sneaking into that final wildcard spot was surprising to me, despite his excellent defense and field goal percentage. I was also surprised to see Jalen Brunson so low on the list. He was actually the next one after Bam. Otherwise, though, I think the list looks pretty fair. I would definitely keep the starters as is, but subjectively, I think I would swap Claxton with either Trae Young or DeMar DeRozan. So, that's it. What do you think of our All-Star selection formula? Do you think it shows fair All-Star teams, or do you think the nerds are ruining basketball with the advanced metrics and formulas? Who do you think should be All-Stars this season in the NBA? Let me know in the comments, and thanks for tuning in.